I told the story on here about how we had the twins with the surrogate and IVF and the experimental surgery, but there's another little part of this story I haven't told. Our twins were born on November 1st, 2019, and my daddy died on January 2nd, 2020. They were 2 months and 1 day old. He died from severe COPD, complications from that. So when he died on the 2nd, and then we buried him on January 6th, in between those days, the twins got RSV. We came home the night after the visitation, and our little girl was doing okay, but as the night went on, she got worse and worse and worse. I locked myself in the bathroom with her and turned the shower on as hot as it would go to steam up the room. We did everything the pediatrician told us. And finally, I told Walter, I said, I can't put one foot in front of the other, but we have to go to the ER. Something's not right. We drove to Murfreesboro to the ER. My mama came over and watched Shepherd. They took her in, had her on oxygen, doing, everything they could do. And they said, we have to transfer her to Vanderbilt because we're not a pediatric hospital. I remember the EMT walking in there, and he said, do you mind if we wait about 45 minutes or so because we're fixing to do a shift change? And he was nice about it. It was not, it was not a bad thing. And I said, I'm sorry, but no, you cannot wait. We have to go now because we're burying my daddy in the morning. So we get on the ambulance. They told Walter to go home and get our little boy, because they wanted to admit him too, since they knew he had it. So I got on the ambulance with our little girl, and they tried laying her out on the stretcher, and her oxygen level would drop entirely too low. On the interstate, they ended up unstrapping her, putting me in the stretcher, stretching me down, and I held her up. I remember that EMT looking at me, and he said, whatever you do if we have a wreck, don't you let go. And I said, I'm not going to. So we also called my in-laws to come to Nashville because they were putting them in the pediatric ICU. My husband got up there with our little boy, and we were both in separate rooms with them. And I think at that point it was probably like 6 o'clock in the morning, and my in-laws got there, and we traded places and left. It was horrible. We did not know it at the time. It started a little afterward. Our little girl was going into respiratory failure. So we were walking into the funeral home. We left the hospital. We went home, we changed clothes, and we went straight to the funeral home. And when we were walking in, my mother-in-law called us and said, what all they were doing, and they were putting the BiPAP on our little girl. I think several people now are starting to see the video of what I said at my daddy's funeral, or part of what I said. So I left the pediatric ICU unit, went back home, changed clothes, went to the funeral, gave that speech, and that's not all of it. That's just part of it. Went to church, ate with the family, and we were I was getting ready to go back to the hospital. Walter looked at me and he said, you need somebody to drive you to Nashville. You can't drive to Nashville. And I said, I am absolutely fine. The next thing I know, I woke up and we were pulling in the parking lot. He had to stay home because he had to go to work the next day, and he also had to take care of the farm. I walked into the pediatric ICU unit wearing the dress from my daddy's funeral. And I wore it the next 4 days because I never left the hospital. They ended up releasing our little boy because they thought he had already peaked. So he stayed a day or two and then went home. My mama and my aunt brought him home because, again, Walter was trying to work and help take care of the farm and feed for me. Our little girl finally got better. They released her. We went home. I went home for about 2 to 3 hours, maybe, long enough to take a shower and change. And then our little boy started doing the exact same thing and going into respiratory failure. So I immediately put him in the car, and we drove back to the ER because I was worried about his breathing, so I did not want to drive on to Nashville. We stopped in Murfreesboro, same exact thing. They brought him in, gave him oxygen, did all these things, and then they put us on an ambulance and sent us to Nashville. I stayed there with him for, I think, 3 to 4 days because he was in the middle of his peak when they admitted him, and we were actually able to skip the step-down floor and go home in 3 or 4 days after that. So we went from doing all this in IVF and being so excited to have these new babies to me losing my daddy and then them going into respiratory failure the night of his funeral. So if you've watched that video and the speech I gave about my daddy, just imagine I'd been in the pediatric ICU unit all night, and I gave that speech and I turned around and went right back and ended up staying there for several days.